Hey fearsome friends, I've got another episode full of great stories for you. A Ted Bundy wannabe, a man who is obsessed with ordering takeouts, and one boy who was just downright evil. So lock your doors and get cozy, comfy, warm. Are you scared yet? Keep being creepy. This happened during the summer of 2015, when I was still living in my hometown and I had just graduated high school. One night I was out with some friends and it was getting really late, like around 1 a.m. So I decided it was time to head home. On my way I stopped by a drugstore close to my house that was a 24/7 to pick up some aspirin and snacks. To note, the one I went to was in the same parking lot as a supermarket, and this is important for later. So I parked my car up close to the store, and it was pretty empty. There were no more than 2 other cars, and they were in the giant parking lot that I was nowhere near. I headed into the store and grabbed what I needed quickly, because at that point I had an overwhelming feeling of dread the whole time I was there. I felt like someone was watching me, but I couldn't see anyone else there besides me and the cashier. Then after I had gotten everything I wanted, I stalled at the checkout, going aisle by aisle, looking at random things, because I thought that whoever was out there would leave if I was taking too long. Honestly, the whole time I thought I was just being paranoid, because I wasn't used to being out late. After 20 minutes of stalling, I paid for my stuff and left the store. Getting to the exit, I literally bolted to my car with pepper spray in hand and immediately locked myself in. I turned my head to check the back seat, and just before I could breathe a sigh of relief because no one was there, someone suddenly tapped on my window. I looked around before I left the store near the entrance and no one was around my car, so how did I not see this person? Now this is where I really freaked out, because I don't know if this person was inspired by Ted Bundy or what, but this guy was really odd. He was very handsome, blonde, and with slightly long hair and a cast on his arm. My very first instinct was to drive off, but he was leaning on the front hood part of my car, and I didn't want to hurt him, so I rolled my window down just an inch so he could speak and maybe back up just a bit so I could drive off without hitting him. But no, he stayed glued on my car, and then asked me if I could help him with directions and look up an address for him. I said, I really need to go, sir. Maybe ask in the drugstore if they can help. Already went to the supermarket and they couldn't help, he replied. The place he was talking about closed at 8, and there was no way this guy had just been lurking around for 5 hours waiting for some random girl's help. He then went on about feeling really tired, asking if I could just give him some of the water or food I'd just bought since he had no money. I told him okay and began to reach to my passenger's side to grab the chips that I'd bought. As I began to roll down my window slightly, as expected, he moved closer to it, so he was now off the car. So at that moment I hit the gas and he chased my car as I heard a scraping sound on the side as I pulled away. I decided not to drive directly home, just in case I was followed, so I drove down the highway for an hour because I was so distraught over what had just happened. Eventually I got home, and getting out of the car, I noticed that the entire side of it had been scraped from the door almost to the trunk. I'm pretty sure he'd used a knife or some sharp object, because it was a really rough scrape. I reported the incident, but they never found him or had any similar incidents in my town. He must have been watching me the whole time I was at the store, maybe from the windows, because how else would he have known that I'd bought food? I also think he'd hidden behind my car so I couldn't see him when I came out. I feel like he was trying to get me before I'd gotten into my car, but he wasn't anticipating on how fast I was going to be. This happened late in 2015 when I was working as a graphic designer for a very small startup company in rural New York State. There were just 4 of us in a rented building that the owner shared with a computer repair shop. I was the only female, which I was fine with, a nice group of geeky sweethearts. I'd been there maybe a month and worked closely with the web programmer. He was a young guy, around 23, and a gentle giant type. Tall, husky, muscular, with tattoos and a shaved head, but super sweet and laid back. We'd often take smoke breaks together and just talk, but I didn't know much about his home life, other than he'd just moved in with his new girlfriend. She'd usually pick him up after work, but if she worked late, he'd have to walk home by himself along the highway in the dark. When we found this out, the boss immediately started offering him lifts. I wondered what his situation was though. Lost car or license, but didn't want to put him on the spot to ask. He was kinda shy. Anyway, time passes and one day the boss wasn't in, so I offered to drive him home instead. His rental is a small house behind a boarded-up car wash in the boonies, and you'd have to drive down a short, dark private road to get to it. You'd never have known the place existed were you just driving by. We talk for a minute in the car and finish our smokes, and I tell him I'll see him tomorrow. And that's when it got weird. He looked at the house for several seconds, quiet, not moving to open the door at all. And then he said, "Yeah," in this strange, resigned voice, then slowly turned his head to look at me. Now you have to realize in real life, people almost never slowly turn their heads to look at you. So you can only imagine how creepy it is until someone actually does it to you. Add the fact that you are a 120-pound woman and he's a huge guy, in a parked car behind an abandoned car wash in the pitch dark with no other house in sight. This was not the look a guy gives you, say, after a first date when he wants a kiss. It was so off, and not an awkward or shy kind of off. He looked at me in the kind of way you'd look in your cupboard when you can't decide what to eat, or if you should be eating anything at all. His mouth was slightly open, and he was staring me straight in the face with a slight squint, as if struggling hard to figure something out. Yet it was me who was the thing. That sudden shift of being looked at like a thing, not the amiable co-worker he'd been laughing and chatting with and getting to know over the past month. It scared the crap out of me. In less than a minute, he had gone from his normal self into a state of tense, disassociated slow motion. He actually looked bigger to me as well. I asked if he was okay, and after maybe 15 long seconds, he looked back to the house, either sighed or gave another resigned yeah, and finally got out of the car. Needless to say, I did not plan on giving him any more rides, but a week later it didn't matter. He blew his brains out with a shotgun on the front porch of that rental house. His poor girlfriend was inside, waiting for him to finish his cigarette. It was then from his family that we finally got the backstory. He'd been a newly sober alcoholic with DUIs from earlier in the year that explained the no-car situation. He'd also had several serious injuries from car wrecks and blackouts over the years, the last actually resulting in 2 small, permanent dents in his skull, which I'd noticed. The build-up of brain injuries had done far more damage than sobriety could reverse. His girlfriend admitted that ever since his last accident, he'd had intrusive, violent fantasies and impulses that he had never experienced before, of hurting others and himself, and you can imagine where my mind went after hearing that. It's certainly my creepiest personal experience, though when I think of it today, all I can feel is sorrow for this poor kid who barely started his life, who was in the end strong enough to fight the demons, demanding other lives, but not his own. So back in November 2020, I was in and out of hospital with testicular torsion 8 times altogether. Because hey, why permanently fix a medical issue when you can temporarily fix it? Thanks, NHS. And on my last time at one of the hospitals, I had called the taxi to go home. But unfortunately it was going to take about 30 to 40 minutes to get to me, because it was a Saturday in the city. So since there was going to be a bit of a wait, I decided to sit down on a bench in the garden area, just in front of the hospital. It was 3 a.m, about 0 degrees, and I had been awake for 36 hours at that point. But my taxi was on its way, and I just sat cross-legged on the bench, headphones in, and nicotine keeping me alive. Everything was fine until after 10 minutes, when I noticed a guy very clearly walking directly towards me. He was stumbling a little, so I just assumed he was drunk, and as he got on a level with me, he stopped right in front of me and said something that I couldn't hear. I looked up and said, "What? Sorry, I had my music on." As I pulled off my headphones, he looked me dead in the eyes and just said, "I could batter you right now." Now, of everything I was expecting him to say, that wasn't on the list. So caught off guard, I tried just dismissing him with humour by saying, "I don't doubt it," which did work, thank God, because he would have absolutely pummeled me into the ground. And every time I said that or something similar, he'd just say, "I could batter you. I want to deck you right here, right now, and I could take you in a fight," just to recall a few of them. After his anger had toned down, he sat on the bench next to me and started generally drunk rambling about his family, his friends, and very specifically his best friend's girlfriend that he was having an affair with. He then pointed out my shoes and said, "Those are nice, mate. Can I have them?" Obviously I said no firmly but not aggressively, then said thanks and told him about the fact I'd got them on sale. He then said, "Can I touch them?" Which was immediately a big red flag. I politely declined and he started rubbing my shoe anyway. I was still sitting cross-legged on the bench. Then in one swift movement, he grabbed my ankle, pulled my entire leg up to his face, and put the entire shoe of my size 11 Converses in his mouth. At which point, while sitting in stunned silence, I started desperately looking around to thankfully see the hospital police walking over. The officer asked if we were here together, and he said yes, and I said no. The officer then asked if he was a patient. I said yes, he said no. I told the officer I was just waiting for my taxi, and the guy rambled something to the officer that I couldn't really make out, who suggested he move along. The guy then stood up, gave me a handshake and walked off into the night. The officer obviously asked if I was okay, and I told him what had happened. He was just as confused as I was. After that, my taxi was due in 5 minutes, so I went and stood on the opposite side of the hospital where the taxi rank was. I asked some friends, who are familiar with a lot of drugs, what he could have been on, and they unanimously said it was meth, and the shoe thing was probably just a fetish. So I'm your average white girl with light brown hair, sun-kissed skin, and mesmerizing blue eyes. I was pretty much an ugly duckling growing up, until I turned 16 and started working as a cashier. Honestly, it wouldn't have been as bad if I'd actually worked in the town I lived in, but I'd decided to work in a nearby city, as I lived between said town and city. I remember the few times I was hit on when I was 16, which were thrilling for me, as no one had before. But the more I worked, the more I realized where I was working, and I was the odd one out. The demographic where I worked was predominantly Hispanic, so I work with a large language barrier and heavy on cash and EBT transactions. I would always find myself so jealous of girls I worked with, as they were better than me in many ways. They were bilingual, slim and short. I wouldn't say I was the only white girl there, but as time moved on, the only girls who were hit on the most were pale with coloured eyes, regardless of being Hispanic or white. Honestly though, thinking about it right now, there are probably 3 young white girls in a service department of 130, and since I've worked there for 3 years now, it doesn't seem different for me anymore, and I feel like everyone else. Now let me tell you about Michael. I have seen him a handful of times throughout my time working at the store, and I don't particularly care for customers, but this one really stuck out and snuck up on me at the same time. Michael is basically your Hispanic cowboy. He had the shoes, the hat, the clothes, and the belt of a guy who drives a low-riding truck. I work on the self-checkout for the majority of the time, especially during the last year or so I usually have plenty of regulars that I spot. But this one always gave me the weirdest feeling. I hate to say this, but I would always judge him in my head. I'd be all smiles on the outside, but I'd be secretly ridiculing him. He always comes around 4 to 5 p.m. around rush hour, always buys 1 or 2 items, then comes up to me and looks me straight in the eyes and smiles. Even since the masks have been implemented, the smiling was always there, lingering in the strangest way. I didn't judge him because of the creepy stares though, but of the way he looked. Most guys around the city either dressed up really nicely or not at all. Seeing this man every day in a different outfit wasn't the problem. It was the obesity. His pants never fit right. Some of his shirts were barely hanging on due to the fat rolling out, and his belt was probably ripping. It's as if he wore the same clothes he wore since he was 16, but food got to him as he got older and looks around 24 to 25. I've seen him more frequently since the new year, and I have always greeted him and said goodbye, but it's not special treatment on my part, just my job. I have gone through so many guys that have had the balls to ask me out due to a nice hello or a subtle eye squint, but I have a boyfriend and have done for the last year. Now I usually like to keep my personal and professional life separate, so most people don't know much about me in general. So I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Michael or any other guy had asked any co-worker of mine if I'd had a boyfriend, and I'm pretty sure the answer would have been, I don't think so. Recently, however, I have gotten an influx of comments from Michael. Instead of smiling / staring into my soul, it would be, "Miss Ray." Then he would tilt his head or say, "Have a good day, Ray," when I didn't even know his name. I would just squint my eyes and carry on with the rest of my day. It's not that I'm shaming him for trying to be a nice person towards me, but deep down I always had this uneasy gut feeling about him. It always lingered in the back of my mind that this guy was not a good person. I learned about 2 weeks ago that he'd become friends with another co-worker of mine. They would talk for a few minutes when they saw each other, but apparently during this last week, the conversation had only been about me, and my co-worker took note of this and told me. Michael had asked questions like, was I single? How old was I? How long had I worked there? Where did I go to school? Am I in school now? And what did I like to eat, etc., etc. I'm pretty sure all the answers were inconclusive though, and my co-worker mentioned that Michael gave me the creepy vibes too. We made a joke about him being busted, and both laughed, and I go on with my day as if nothing had happened. At the beginning of this past week on Monday, I had left for the day before the usual time that Michael would come in. Apparently he'd asked a manager and then a female co-worker of mine if I was there because he wanted to give me a cake. Being told about this the next day really confused me, and I just thought it was funny at first. That is, until he came in and actually gave me a cake. It was a choco flan, and he told me to eat it, saying it was his birthday and he wanted me to have it. But then he just left without another word. This time, however, I had no idea who it was until I quickly asked his name, to which he'd responded with Michael, and that's where things began to get weird. I was contemplating eating the cake, but ultimately decided against it, as it came from someone I never really spoke to, and someone I'd had an uneasy feeling about, no less. Also, that someone had recently started asking questions about me, and we're in a pandemic, so I threw it away a few hours later. After that shift, I was off for 2 days until I came in this past Friday. Michael came in, and I was already very weary of it all. He came up to me, asking if I'd enjoyed the cake, to which I lied and told him it was great, then tried to break away from the conversation. As I did though, he lightly grazed my arm and said, "Miss Ray, here is my number. Text me if you want," and placed it in my hand. Written on there was his name and number, then he walked away without another word. I stood there for a second whilst a manager and a co-worker just glanced at me. Then they just carried on with their separate conversations like nothing had happened. But my discomfort was clear from my face, and I remember swallowing hard, picking it up and then placing it in my jacket pocket as if it were for safekeeping. It definitely wasn't. I sometimes wish I wasn't the way I am, but I told a manager and 2 co-workers about it later, to which they all agreed was weird. But the manager suggested I make him pay to be able to talk to me, and all of the discomfort washed away after that idea, and I thought to myself, what's the worst he could do now? But it was a bad mistake to think that he couldn't do anything else, other than look into my soul after I didn't text him. I didn't see him the next day, and I'd honestly forgotten all about it. I had told my boyfriend about Michael giving me the cake, but never about him giving me his number, because I knew he would get annoyed at me for letting it get to that point. But how else was I supposed to reject a guy who walks away immediately before I can say anything? Michael always comes in, says what he has to say, then walks away before I can get a word in. But today was the worst, as after every interaction I've had at work, this one really messes with my head, especially since this is still something I will be dealing with tomorrow, and however long he continues with this. Now, I was on my lunch break in my car. I was parked a ways out so no customers could see me, but at the same time no one drove or parked near me in general, as I like to be away from other vehicles. I was sat watching TikTok when from the corner of my eye I saw Michael walking into the store. I waited for a minute before I pulled out my phone, and I started recording me talking about the situation on a private TikTok video. I'll never actually post it, but it's just something to look back on. As I was describing the situation, I noticed him come back out completely empty-handed when he'd suddenly glanced in my direction. I quickly ducked my head down so he hopefully wouldn't see me, and at first I don't think he did. But when I looked over and saw him getting into his truck, or at least standing by it, he was over in the next row of parking spots from me, so was a good 60 to 80 feet away. I stopped the video, then saw him go to the driver's side and look over at my car again. I put my sun visor up to block my head from his view, and my lunch was quickly coming to an end when I noticed him still standing outside of his truck. I sat there and waited for him to leave, but he never did. I then saw him take off his jacket, then put it back on again. I could only see from his chest downwards, as I was blocking off the view of his face with the visor in hopes he wouldn't see mine. But then he started walking towards my car. At first I wasn't sure what to do, so I just sat there and tried to breathe. What's the worst that could happen, right? I remember getting nervous, and I thought about driving off, but I thought it would seem mean and indecent of me. But I was absolutely terrified, I'm not going to lie. Every possibility flooded my mind until he came up to my car and finally tapped on my window. It sounded inhumane at first, almost like a screeching tap, and that's when I noticed the pocket knife. I pretended not to see him and continued watching my TikTok videos. I just wanted to watch my videos and for him to go away, and at that point I'd started shaking uncontrollably and I couldn't swallow. Michael then went over to my passenger side from around the back and started to wave, smile and talk to me. I didn't see the knife at that time, but he then tried to open my door. He pulled at the handle and thankfully I'd remembered to lock my doors, so he walked back around back to my door and knocked on my window again, asking if I was alright, how I've been, and why I haven't texted him, etc. I just smiled with a face of shock. My gut feeling was right, and it was the most scariest and unpleasant thing I have ever experienced. He then walked around again, and honestly was there for a good minute or two, just looking at my car, until he waved goodbye and walked away, telling me to, "Have a good day, Miss Ray." As he left, I quickly caught a video of him, then turned off my phone and just stared into nothing, going through the realizations and the what-ifs. What if I hadn't locked my doors? I was shaking and couldn't think or breathe, and I was contemplating my next move. Should I leave my car? I needed to go back to work. I just wanted peace and quiet, but got this instead. I glanced over and saw him get into his truck. He then waited for a few minutes, then drove off. I couldn't get a clear view of his license plates, but I still got a letter or two, plus the make and model. Now this was all very unsettling for me. He could come in here any time he wanted, and now he knows what my car looks like. A moment or two after I saw his truck leave, I got out and went inside, clocked in and told my manager. I told her the situation and what had just happened, and her response was just plain awful. She told me that he was harmless and that I was probably making it up. I was literally shaking so badly that I couldn't even speak. You know that feeling of being in Walmart at 11 p.m, high on sugar and super tired, and your world feels big and your eyes feel wide? That's what it felt like for me for a good hour, but in the middle of a rush. For that time I had forgotten about it, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I told another manager about it, but she victim blamed me too, saying I'd probably led him on. But she seemed to be at least a little on my side when she said it was weird, and I probably had just said hi and he thought it was flirting, plus the way he'd come up to my car. But it was quickly disregarded. I just didn't speak to her or the other girl again after that, and I still haven't told anyone higher up because I don't trust anyone here anymore. They do nothing to support me. From time to time I'll have a customer who comes in and stares into my soul while standing next to his girlfriend and child, basically having sex with me with their eyes. Other times I have vendors or other customers who tell me I'm so beautiful they want to see me naked. And to top it all off, I have Michael trying to get into my car with a knife in his hand. I think the creepiest customer award definitely goes to Michael, but my well-being is fine. I'm fine. I don't feel scared anymore, and I actually laugh at the whole situation now, but that's maybe how I cope with trauma. This really takes the cake. I learnt later on that his father had been arrested several times and owns a local Mexican restaurant that Michael works at, and this isn't the first time he's done stuff like this. According to one of the managers, he'd previously come out late at night to stalk his ex, and it became such a problem that the girl would hide every time she saw him, but eventually just stopped going into the store. I guess now I'm his next target. Yes, if I encounter him again, I will reject him. But Jesus, I don't think I've ever been that scared in all my life. So this is a weird memory that had gotten buried away somewhere far in the back of my mind. I only recently recalled it because of a sarcastic joke my boyfriend made about a weird guy in our apartment, and the memories came flooding back. I was probably 8 or 9 when this happened in 2003. I lived in a large apartment complex where a lot of the kids would come out to play in the later afternoon after we had finished our homework. We'd ride our bikes around the parking lot and play tag or hide and seek around the building. We weren't really supervised vigilantly. It was a safe neighbourhood, and parents had gotten comfortable taking their eyes off the kids for long periods while they played outside. The apartment also had one of those arm barrier gates, which wasn't very secure, but it made residents feel like it was. One day we noticed a guy sitting in the corner of the parking lot. He looked homeless. He was incredibly dirty and was talking to himself loudly. My friends and I assumed that he was crazy, and we got a bit scared, so we went inside to play instead. The next day he came around again, this time while we were all playing. We saw him walk into the parking lot by talking loudly again and again, and we got scared and went inside as he started to come close to us. I don't believe any of us told our parents as yet. My mum was hardly home anyway because she was working, but I think we all treated it like a game. Outrun the crazy person. And then we'd go up to our balconies and giggle and laugh from the thrill of it. We truly didn't understand at that age the danger or risk to us. I had been taught about stranger danger, of course, but this wasn't a bad area of the city, and I had never experienced a dangerous stranger before, so I was truly oblivious to the risk. This went on for almost a week, where he would show up most days and we would scare off. One day I heard police sirens and looked out the balcony to see the guy being trampled over and held by policemen, and quite a few of the neighbours were out. There was lots of screaming and shouting, and after some time he was taken away in the police car. I always wondered what happened to the crazy guy, and felt bad that he was treated that way just because he was a bit crazy. Now I put crazy in quotation marks because I'm in the mental health field, and I take offence at that word. But that's what my 8-year-old brain used to label him then. Only years later, when I was maybe 13, did I find out from my mum that the crazy guy had come that day before most of us kids went down to play, and had managed to lure a 6-year-old boy who lived 2 floors below me, he had gone down to kick a ball around, to an area behind a parking garage and molested him there. His mum came to call him back inside and found him nowhere. She yelled for help and people came out, and the guy, scared from all the noise and commotion, ditched the boy and ran from behind the garage to make a run for it. One of the neighbours, who was a man, jumped at him and they all held him until the police came. I don't know what happened to that boy. I was never friends with him particularly, and his family had moved away by the time I found out. I don't even remember his name. But finding out about that was such a slap to my face and made me have a scary realization of how serious the situation was that we used to giggle at. I don't know if Crazy Guy was mentally ill, or if he was on drugs or what, but I hope he got treatment for whatever issues he had and then was locked away for good in prison. I hope that little boy got all the support he needed to deal with such a traumatic thing in a place where he felt safe. I really hope he's doing okay now. Safe to say, we hired a new apartment security guard after that point. In 2019, I was a delivery driver for a place I won't name, and I'd worked there for a while and loved the job. Generally, I'm an extroverted person and loved chatting with people. It was good fun. But I'd also had my fair share of mildly creepy encounters, given that I'm a girl and I was delivering in one of the sketchier areas of my city. I'd never thought much of these encounters though, or saw any real threats. But one night in particular has stuck with me. So I worked the night shift from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m, and around 8 p.m. that night, some guy had ordered his food, and the delivery was easy enough. However, his house was kind of creepy, as there were no lights on, and when he answered the door, there was a foul smell that immediately hit me. Also, he didn't say anything. I proceeded in saying my usual. So that's there for you, and could I get you to fill this out? Which was the tip thing. But he didn't reply at all, or acknowledge me asking him to sign the slip. I didn't think much of it and headed back to the store, and almost exactly the moment that I'd arrived back, another order popped up to the same house, and he'd ordered the exact same thing. I was confused, but still not too worried, so took the delivery out and had the exact same experience. No lights on, smelled bad, and he didn't say anything. Heading back to the store again, I was feeling pretty uncomfortable, but again didn't think too much of it. Once back, I became even more uncomfortable when yet another identical order was up. My manager at the time didn't understand the creepiness of the whole thing and insisted I take it, despite my reluctance. This time when the door opened, I told him that he could order more than one sandwich at a time, as an attempt at humour, but he didn't say anything again and just closed the door. I was thoroughly creeped out by this point, and I did a sort of sprint back to my car. But when I looked back at the house, I could see that a light was on, and I noticed someone standing in the window. I couldn't make out any features, so I just assumed it was him. But ultimately I don't know who was standing in the window, or why. My manager called me from the store to inform me, before I was even able to start my car, that another identical order for delivery had popped up, and he directed me to leave as quickly as I could, because he was starting to see the danger of the situation. As the call with my manager ended, suddenly the man was running up to my car. I just couldn't move for a second because I was in shock, but he was yelling something that I couldn't understand, so I sped away as fast as I could, given that I was shaking like a leaf. We blacklisted him that night after he'd made several more attempts to call the store, but I still have no idea what his endgame was. I'm 32 years old and a male, and as a kid in the 90s, I would have to walk a mile from the bus stop to my house. The road I lived on was a small gravel road, so the bus didn't go down it as part of its route. It was a very rural part of Pennsylvania, and I hated that walk, especially when a storm was rolling in. So as I was walking down the road this one day, with no other houses around beside ours, and a car pulled up next to me and asked me if I wanted a ride. I don't remember saying yes necessarily, but they'd somehow managed to convince me to get in. It was a tiny car, and there were 2 men sat in the front and 3 in the back. They told me there was plenty of space, but I had to sit on one of the dude's laps. When they dropped me off, I can remember it like it was yesterday. They all waved to me and really happily shouted to me out of the car windows, thanking me profusely. I casually mentioned it later to my parents that night, and my father, who's sadly not here anymore, became furious and interrogated me on what had happened, asking who they were, what they looked like, and exactly what they'd said, etc. I remember telling him that they'd asked me if I was my father's son. They knew his name, and that's how they made me feel like it was okay to get in the car. He repeatedly yelled at me that I am never to get into anybody's car, and I remember him being fixated and asking me about how and what they'd said when they'd thanked me. He made some phone calls and rushed out of the house for the majority of the night, but what still sticks with me to this day is that I remember the ride seeming way longer than it should have been, and I remember having this overwhelming feeling of dread, like I may not actually ever get to go home again. I recalled the sense of disbelief and relief when they'd actually dropped me off in front of my house. But here's the thing. My parents would be at work until 5 p.m, and the time I got home from school was usually around 3:30. I'd been in the car with them for over an hour. So I had been living in Prague for about a year, and I was teaching a third-grade class at a bilingual school, and during the night I worked door security for a tourist bar. On the weekends I would get off work at around 3 or 4 a.m, depending on how busy it was, at which point I would take the tram from the city centre to where my apartment was located. At the time I was 22 years old, and had short black hair and round glasses. This is important for later. So one night on my way home from the bar, I was standing at the back of the tram with headphones in, despite my phone being dead. They were like a security blanket to prevent me from socializing with drunk English speakers that populated city centres at that time of night. There was a group of 7 guys that boarded the tram, who looked to be between 25 and 30, and they were being incredibly loud and were obviously drunk. Now I'm okay with accents, and these guys were definitely British, and were probably there for a stag do. I ignored them, till I heard the following conversation. "I'd have sex with that Harry Potter-looking girl," one of them said. "Yeah, you wish, mate," another replied. Then the first guy said, "Like I'd give her a choice." Then raucous laughter and high-fiving over this little rape joke ensued. "How can you even tell it's a girl?" "One way to find out, isn't there?" Then more laughter. I kept staring at my Kindle and acting like I couldn't hear them, and I didn't speak English, but internally I was screaming in panic. My stop was only 2 away, and I figured I'd want to be as close to my flat as possible when I got off. So I sat there ignoring the leering and jeering until the tram got to my stop. I got off, and I had 3 blocks up and half a block over to get to my flat. But then they got off too, which ultimately was fine, I thought. I live 2 blocks away from a very popular club, and quite a few bars and hotels are in that area too. So I rationalized to myself that they weren't following me, and decided to test it out. It was just a stupid thing I did, just to see if the people walking behind me were actually following me. I crossed at a weird abrupt place in the street, and sure enough they crossed too. I picked up my pace to be walking faster, but not running, and their pace picked up with mine, and laughter emanated from the group behind me. I refused to look back, and made the 3 blocks with them steadily closing the gap between us. I then turned left and bolted. Running as fast as I could, keychain with rock in my palm, and building key between my thumb and pointer knuckle, I slammed the door behind me. And even though it locks automatically and doesn't have a turntable handle, I still threw the deadbolt on and continued running up to my flat, where I also put on the deadbolt. I immediately went to my room, which faced the street, and I curled up in the corner, shaking, as I could hear through my open window. "Where'd that bitch go?" along with other things that I'm not going to post. Eventually, after about 15 minutes, I thankfully heard them go away. So this happened almost 4 to 5 years ago when I was still in college, but I remember it clear as day, and it still freaks me out. I went to college at SUNY, school upstate. It was a pretty small school and town. And one Wednesday night, 2 of my friends and I went into town to go to one of the popular bars for ladies' night. Now usually whenever my friends and I go out, we have a rule where there has to be at least 4 of us, so that God forbid anything happens or someone needs to go home early, there'll still be a pair of friends left to make sure the other was safe. The buddy system. This time though, we figured whatever. It was ladies' night. We'll be fine and probably see our friends at the bar anyway. It's all good. But we pre-gamed a bit too hard though. Once we were at the bar, we were dancing, drinking, and having a great time at ladies' night. Then my one friend, we'll call her Lisa, suddenly became absolutely wasted, just like that. She was falling over herself and couldn't stand up straight. But I didn't notice because I was off talking to some guy. The most sober of my friends, we'll call her Sally, then came up to me and said that the bouncers had kicked them out. She needed to take Lisa home right away, and she's waiting outside. I refused to go with them because I wanted to hang out with this guy I'd met. So Sally got annoyed and left because the bouncers were yelling at her to take care of her friend outside. Sally and Lisa then ran to catch the bus back to campus, which was down a long straight road from the bar we were at. And once Sally and Lisa had gotten on the bus, she saw the guy that I'd been talking to. She asked him what he was doing and where I was, and he said that I'd wanted to stay. Sally became even more frustrated and scared now, because she had no idea who I was with at that point. However, she's quickly distracted by Lisa vomiting on the very crowded drunk bus. Once home, Sally was taking care of Lisa and trying to help her as she was throwing up, but I was still at the bar, except I have absolutely no idea what I was doing. We hadn't been there for long before Sally and Lisa left, but I had stayed there for around 30 to 60 minutes, but it felt like hours, and I was totally alone. Now this is not like me at all. I can get anxious and shy in social situations if I don't know anyone, and for the most part I'm pretty responsible and always aware. But I had no idea who I was with, what I was drinking, or what I was doing. Nothing. I just have this brief moment of clarity where it felt like I'd literally stepped back from reality, looking around at the bar and knowing something was not right and that I was in trouble, trying to piece together what the hell was going on. It was like I was watching from a distance, frozen, and everything else was resuming around me. I knew I was drunk, but this felt different. Everything felt so clear. It was such a different type of intoxication that made me think maybe it wasn't just alcohol in my system. I made my way outside, not knowing what to do, and immediately looked to my left and saw a group of Townie-looking guys. I went up to them drunkenly, and I guess I'd asked for help or if they knew where my friends were. But I don't know what prompted me to do this, apart from being drunk and out of it. But the three guys were looking me up and down, and one in particular seemed super into me and was way more talkative than the rest. They all looked to be between 25 and 35 years old, and I had just turned 19 at the time. I remember that the one that liked me said that they'll walk me to the bus stop since it was right there, and I guess in the state that I was in, I didn't know how to get home even though the bus stop was literally in eyesight. So I was at the bus stop with these guys, and I remember feeling a sudden sense of dread, anxiety and fear wash over me, like someone had just thrown water in my face, and I'd suddenly realized how much danger I was in. I was standing there at the bus stop, wrapping my arms around my body for warmth, not knowing what the hell to do. And the second that I took a step back and realized what was going on in the bar to now, it felt like I was floating above my body and watching myself. I knew I was making a bad decision, and I knew I was in danger, but I couldn't seem to do anything to get myself out of the situation. I couldn't walk away from them, I couldn't speak, I couldn't physically remove myself from what was going on. It felt like I had taken a back seat to my own destruction. I started to become really upset and even more scared, when suddenly, out of nowhere, my roommate called me. She had been asleep as she wasn't someone that went out partying and was usually in bed early. But she woke up in the middle of the night, saw I wasn't home yet, and said she'd got this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. Kind of like a mother's intuition, I guess. See, I went out and partied pretty often, so it wasn't out of the ordinary for me to come home late or for me to spend the night at Lisa's dorm in a different building across campus. But she texted Sally and asked if they'd been out with me. And Sally said yes, but that her and Lisa had had to leave me behind. My roommate frantically called me, and when I answered I was slurring my words beyond belief. She asked where I was, and I said I was at the bus stop. The entire time that I was on the phone, the guy that liked me was leaning over and whispering in my ear, saying, "Tell her you're fine, hang up the phone. Tell her we're taking you home. We got you. You're fine, hang up," trying to hurry me off the call. My roommate asked who I was with, and I said no one. But just then she could hear someone in the phone, and as soon as she heard a male voice say, "We're taking you home," she told me that she was coming to pick me up. I remember wanting to cry, but not being able to, still feeling frozen, and I told my roommate that I didn't need her to, and that the bus was about to arrive. All the while, the guys were standing there smirking and giggling, like they got exactly what they wanted. At this point, when I hung up the phone, I kind of accepted that something really bad was about to happen to me, and I felt so upset, because I couldn't help myself. I just stood there waiting with dread for whatever these guys were about to do to me. But apparently, as soon as I'd hung up from my roommate on the phone, she grabbed our other roommates, hopped in the car, and flew into town where the bus stop was, which was maybe like a 5-minute drive from campus. She called me again as their car pulled up in front of the bus stop. The road was about 80 yards away from the actual bus terminal, with the terminal being set back a bit off the road, and I remember literally gasping, feeling the biggest sigh of relief that I'd ever felt in my life. I immediately started hysterically crying and sprinting as fast as I could towards the car, with the guys screaming things at me. I was wearing heels too, and in my attempt to flee, I tripped and fell onto the concrete. It felt like it had just taken me forever to be able to get up. I just didn't have any control over my body. As soon as I got in the car, we were all hysterically crying and feeling extremely grateful that my roommate just so happened to have gotten that bad feeling that woke her up in the middle of the night. She very well could have saved my life that night. I woke up the next day feeling extremely hungover, wearing my jeans inside out and my underwear rolled down and no shirt on. I chalked this up to me being a drunk fool and not being able to dress myself properly, but it was still pretty alarming to wake up in that state. Lisa and I had to take a bus home that morning, which took about 4 hours to get to our hometown. And on the entire journey, we felt sad, groggy and sick, but we'd agreed to not talk about the night before. My friend just quietly looked at me about an hour into the ride and said, "That was not just alcohol that got us like that. Something happened last night." We both cried a little, took a nap and tried not to think about it. We still don't know what happened, and thankfully I never saw those guys ever again during my remaining 3 years there. And from then on, we only ever went out in a group of 4 or more. I'm a female and 18 years old, and this happened to me from the ages of 13 to 15. So I'd never moved schools until high school. So from elementary school to middle school, I was around all of the same people. We all knew each other well and watched each other grow up, and I had a friend around my age that lived in my neighbourhood, and he was extremely weird, shall we say. My first memorable interaction with him was a good one though, as I was invited to his house in 4th grade for his birthday. We had fun playing Star Wars and had lightsaber battles, but one weird thing about this birthday party was the extreme absence of his family. His mother dropped in for maybe 5 minutes to say hi, then just drove off somewhere. So he'd basically celebrated his birthday alone, except for me and his other friend, and we were the ones who ate cake with him and watched him open presents, not his parents. It was odd, but overall non-threatening. But I just wish it had stayed that way. Middle school rolled around, and he had become a completely different person. I had lost touch with him over the year, and my next meeting with him was on the bus. He had grown a lot, and was wearing one of those weird hentai hoodies. He was also showing off an armful of self-harm injuries to other kids on the bus, including me, It was really bad. I talked to him for a little, assuming he wanted some attention because he was struggling, and we kept in touch at school and on social media after that. But then he started sending me pictures of self-harm wounds, so I blocked him, and this made him very, very angry. Side note. This kid was definitely one of those school shooters in the making. He was obsessed with Nazi imagery, and unbeknownst to me was openly racist. He would call kids slurs, especially the black kids, because he thought they were lesser than him. He bullied a disabled boy until he raged, and the disabled boy was thrown off the bus. He later strangled the kid with his bag strap while sitting in the seat behind, and the common theme in this story? The teachers did absolutely nothing about it. He'd infiltrated my friend's group by dating one of my friends, who had extremely low self-esteem. He would spam group chats with porn and try to do sexual roleplays with us. We all said no and wanted to cut him off. My friend who he was dating was very important to us. They had an abusive relationship, and wherever he went, she unfortunately had to go too. A couple of months later, the sexual harassment started, but it wasn't just aimed at us. He was groping the whole school. He didn't discriminate. He would grab at boys and girls, and he was one of the biggest boys in the grade at roughly about 6'2" in middle school. I was a favourite target of his, probably because up until this point I had been nice to him. At first it was little swats or weird comments about my body, but it culminated to him sexually assaulting me on the bus. The bus was mostly empty when he did it, and the driver was one of those adults that chooses to ignore everything around him, the bystander effect and all. He'd cornered me in a seat near the back, and I've always been little, so it was easy for him. Then he leaned in for a hug and grabbed my breast, really hard. I was crying and managed to kick him off me, which led him to feign innocence. I was too afraid to tell my mum. The last incident with me was in the end of 8th grade. One night when I was home alone with a friend, he had texted me about being suicidal, which I ignored. But then he started spamming me about how he didn't want to die a virgin and weird sexual things like that. He started talking about how he saw me as pure and how he wanted to rape me and then kill me and himself. I was so scared. Then when all of a sudden we heard banging on the front door, which lasted for about an hour, with him telling us to let him in. But thankfully he left when we'd threatened to call the police and lied about recording him too. I moved house shortly after that. Later on, I'd heard that he'd finally gotten into trouble with the police because he had been slowly grooming my friend, which we had no idea about. He had bullied her into sending sexual videos of herself, which basically amounted to child porn. There were hundreds of videos of her doing things like sticking items into herself and dancing for him. But for also being a child himself, he'd mastered grooming quite well. He'd also raped her, which he never faced the consequences for, and her parents and the school didn't believe her, which led to her getting harassed at school. She made him angry by sticking up for herself, and in retaliation, he released everything, including a brief video of the rape. He sent it to her family, friends, and everyone else at school. Several students reported it, and he was arrested. He was charged as a minor for distribution and went to juvie. I haven't seen or talked to him in years, but I thought of this story because he'd tried to add me on social media recently. Obviously I blocked his creepy ass, but I don't know if he's still on parole or anything. He's the scariest and most disturbing person I've ever met in my entire life, and he caused so much trauma for so many people. So there is a park just on the outskirts of town that I've hiked around almost 1,000 times. It's not much of a hike, and not so much a mountain. It's more like a small hill that takes about 15 minutes to the summit and gives you a great vantage point just above the tree line to be able to catch a sunset. Now, I'm very familiar and comfortable with the area, and walking it alone, as I've been here so many times. At dawn, dusk, even in the middle of the night, to catch a meteor shower. So one day I was in the area driving by at around sunset, and I had some spare time, so I decided to swing by. I made the short walk up to the top and immediately took in my surroundings, in a peaceful alone time kind of way, but also a head on a swivel way too. As a woman very comfortable with travelling and hiking alone, I'm still no stranger to being stalked in grocery stores or malls, etc. The hill plateaus onto a big open rocky area where you can pretty much see everyone who is up there. A couple here, a couple there, friends sitting on rocks chatting, a random guy kind of far off working out. So I took a couple of pictures on my phone as the sun was going down and decided to get out of there before it got too dark. I stood up to leave, and when I turned around, the workout guy was suddenly a lot closer to me than he was earlier, maybe a couple of yards away, just stretching and squatting. This instantly hit me as weird, and that gut instinct is always right. So I started walking down the hill towards the trail to leave, and he started to leave at the same time. At this point I was wrestling with, am I being paranoid, or is he actually leaving too since it's getting dark? So I just stopped walking about halfway down the hill, which is an awkward place to stop, just to test out my theory. And he stopped too, pretending to stretch and do more squats and little workouts. Again, I was still wondering if he was actually following me, or was it just a coincidence? So I walked back up the hill to the top again and just started milling around, wondering what to do. Now, he didn't follow me back up completely, but he definitely didn't continue down the hill either, and didn't let me leave his eyesight. He was waiting for me. The sun was going down fast now, and I realized that we both knew the same thing, that we'd soon be up there alone, together, in complete darkness. I quickly scanned the area, looking for other folks who were up there with us, but quickly realized that while I was quietly panicking and planning an escape, they'd mostly all left the area. I saw one couple who had made it almost completely down the hill to the trail, so I figured I'd catch them up and just follow closely behind the whole way out, so that the man might be discouraged in trying anything in front of other people. I made my way towards them, having to pass the workout man on the way, while he's still pretending to stretch. But sadly they'd veered off to the left to take another trail that went further into the woods and away from the parking area. My heart sank, and for a split second I considered going up to them and asking them to walk me out. But they were younger than me and clearly just wanted to have a good time in the woods together. I got to the trail and just started fast walking my way out of there. It's maybe a 10-minute walk to the parking area, so I figured I could make it. He also hadn't followed behind me when I'd passed him, so I was hoping that I could beat him out of there. However, not soon after that thought, he came jogging up behind me and placed himself directly behind me. Now when I say trail, this is not your typical skinny wooded trail that might come to mind. It was less wide and open than the plateau, but you could probably walk 20 people side by side and still not have them reach the tree line that runs parallel. So in other words, there was absolutely no reason for him to be directly behind me. He could have jogged several yards away and passed me with ease if he'd wanted to, yet he stayed right on my heels. I was completely frozen with fear, but I didn't speed up. I kept my pace and just kept walking. Part of me didn't want to give him the satisfaction of taking off running, and I also feared that might escalate the situation into an actual attack. With each fearful step I was telling myself, "This is it, be ready." I usually hike with bear mace and a knife on me, but since this was not a pre-planned excursion, I found myself completely helpless and just braced myself for the fight of my life. Anyone who visits this area knows that you don't have a phone signal from the moment you step out of your car, But as an instinct, I dialed a friend, put my phone to my ear and cleared my throat. It was a weak hope that it would actually go through, but as we neared the parking area, I still held my phone up just in case I came across a small bubble of signal. At that moment, the workout man passed me, jogged straight to his car and immediately got in and took off. Originally, I'd feared reaching the parking area, assuming that would be a good chance to try something, as he could easily take my body away with him. But after the longest walk of my entire life, I still don't know what to think about this situation. Shortly afterwards, I learned about creeps who get joy from freaking women out and nothing more. Or maybe I'm just too paranoid, listened to one too many true crime podcasts, and now think everyone is out to get me. So this happened when I was about 10 or 11. So we're going back to 2006 or 2007. It was Halloween night, and it was the first time my parents were letting me go trick-or-treating alone with my friends. Keep in mind this was a very small town where I was born and grew up, and it was the type of community where everyone would look out for each other's children. So there were adults present around us the entire night, just not any trailing my particular group of 3, who were me and my 2 best friends. The night so far had gone without a hitch. We picked a few streets to go up and down to collect our candy in our empty pillowcases, and it was probably around 7 in the evening, just before our 8:30 curfew. We made our way down one of the less populated streets where there was a few houses shaped like domes. Think Patrick's Rock from SpongeBob, only a lot more glass. And I hadn't really gone down that street too many times before. I didn't know anybody who lived there, but we made our merry way down there in hopes of some Reese's or Kit Kats. However, we quickly came to realize that most of the houses were dark, and when a house is dark on Halloween, it's a sign you shouldn't knock. Although one of the dome houses was lit up, so we walked up to it and prepared ourselves for some more sugar. When the door opened, a man answered. He was at least in his 40s, definitely middle-aged, and I knew he wasn't a father of any of the kids I knew, but he seemed friendly enough. He invited us inside for candy, and because we were raised in such a bubble of a town, we obliged. Luckily, we weren't met with death or impending danger, but instead we were met with a Polaroid camera. The man told us he wanted to take a picture of our Halloween costumes for the local newspaper, and he motioned to the left of us where a corkboard of Polaroids sat, displaying at least a dozen photographs of kids from the neighbourhood cheesing at the camera in their costumes. So again, we stupidly obliged. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but after the photo, he gave us candy and we were on our way home. When I told my mum about it later that night, she was horrified, of course. She called up the other moms, and the 3 of us got a nice long lecture on stranger danger, something we had been previously taught but ignored. We scoured the local newspaper and the surrounding town papers for photos of the town's kids in Halloween costumes, but we never found any. I didn't feel as if he was capable of actually hurting us, but I do count myself lucky that nothing bad actually did happen. So I used to work as a 911 operator, and this story I'm about to tell you was the scariest call of them all, mainly because I didn't know what was going on. Now this happened 3 years ago, when a woman had called 911, but nothing was being said. Now per my policy at the time, if I had an open line with nothing suspicious being heard, I could disconnect and attempt to call back or leave a voicemail after listening for 1 minute. It had been over a minute, but I thought I could hear arguing in the background, or maybe it was just the TV. But either way, I kept listening. Then this older woman came on the phone and was whispering about her ex finding her, and he was threatening everyone at the house. The house where they were was in the middle of nowhere, so it took quite a time to even get there in the first place, and the whole time I was on the phone, she was explaining to me the DV history he has, how many guns he owns, and which ones he has in his vehicles. As the deputies arrived at the house, they parked at the end of a very, very long driveway and began to walk up. The female I was on the phone with was hiding in a detached shed, while the ex was in the house threatening to kill them if they didn't tell him where she was. She'd kept peeking out to try and spot the cops, but couldn't see them, then lets out the most blood-curdling scream and says someone is shooting. Then ensued 45 minutes of me sitting there listening to a cell phone that had been dropped on the ground, whilst deputies barely had radio coverage to communicate. Eventually they sent out a helicopter to fly overhead, and that was all I could hear at that point, as they did PA announcements. They finally got everyone out and handcuffed, cleared the house and did the investigation on what had happened. No one thankfully got shot or started shooting, but she just heard a really loud boom that was unrelated. But the waiting with no updates was what really got me. The ex apparently went to jail on numerous charges. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels with some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.